Hello, and thanks for attending today's webinar on hiring employees. My name is Eric Ronsky. I'm part of the marketing team here at FMS. This webinar is going to be presented by Chris Cooley of My HR Concierge. So, Chris, I'd like to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Eric. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone's time today. And as Eric said, today we're going to talk about hiring employees and really focus on what is needed. And so we're primarily going to go through four main areas: the interview process, the new hire packet, I-9s, and then employee screening. So when we talk about the employee interview process, so the question is, why do we care? Why do we care if we hire the right people? Well, we care for a lot of reasons. We care because if we don't, it's a cultural issue. If you have a turnstile of employees, and obviously that doesn't really help your environment. We want to hire the right people from an economic standpoint. If you look at the cost of turnover, typically if you're going to hire an entry-level employee, it's going to cost you 30 to 50% of their salary. That's the cost. And that cost is made up of interviewing, so it's your time. It's your time having to go through the hiring process, running background checks, performing all the necessary steps that you have to do, training, reduced productivity, because as you know, typically there's a time where that individual has to get up to speed to where they can do their job and they're not as productive as most likely the person they're replacing. You have lost opportunity costs. Instead of spending 3-4 hours or however long it takes to kind of orient the person and get them hired and get them trained and do those things, you could have been out getting more business, creating value, doing those things. So if you look at all those things, you're looking at, as I said, about 30 to 50% of the salary for an entry-level employee, about 150% on a mid-level employee, and then you're looking at about 400% on a high-level employee. So if we do the math, so let's take an $8 an hour person, and let's assume a 30% we'll do on the low end. To hire that new person, to train them, interview them, and so forth, is going to cost you about $5,000. And then you take that and you look at your employee base and you look at your turnover, and then multiply that those number of employees that you had to hire times that $5,000, and it's a big hidden cost. It's a hidden cost because you don't have a line item on your P&L that says cost of turnover. It's buried because you already have people working. They're 40 hours. It's just instead of creating value, they're going to be training and hiring and interviewing and doing those things. So that's another reason we care. Obviously, it's an extremely expensive endeavor to go out and hire people. And then, as I said, if we hire the wrong people, from a cultural perspective, it just creates issues within the workplace. So if you look at interviewing, it's really made up, for the most part, at a high level for three characteristics, right? It's all based on the job description. If you don't have good job descriptions, it's hard to do a good hiring process. The job description is the basis for everything you need to know for that position. And from that job description, that's where we start developing interview questions, because we may have different interview questions for every position, right? So we may have different questions for that meat department manager versus that front-end cashier. And we need to make sure that these questions relate to that position. It talks about the duties and the needs of that position. And then after that, what we also want to do is to do the interview. And the interview is so important because that's where you get the human element, right? That's where you get to talk to them. You get to figure out, is it a cultural fit? You get to figure out, do you think their personality would fit well within your organization? And I always suggest really be transparent, because if that individual is going to have to work out in the southern heat during the summer for 90% of the time, they really need to know that, because that's something that's going to create an issue for those individuals if they don't expect that. So be transparent, let them know what to expect, the good and the bad, and really make sure that you do that in a good way, because we've all hired good people and we've all hired bad people. If anybody says that if they're a hiring manager and they say that they have never hired a bad employee, run, because they're lying. And so a lot of that, if we'll follow these steps, it'll really help us making sure that we're hiring those right kind of employees. So from a job description perspective, what I suggest is really spend some time developing those. To be honest, years ago, I used to have, we had, I don't know, 300 or 400 people that were under me, and you know, we really didn't use job descriptions. I really didn't understand the importance of them. And you may have something that was just kind of scribbled out on a sheet of paper, but we didn't have real formal job descriptions. And again, it's very important because that's where you spend the time to understand really what you need, which allows you to really know what you need to go find in an employee. An example is, if my wife tells me that she wants earrings for Christmas, and I run out to the store and try and figure out what that is, it takes me a long time, and I probably won't get the right ones. If she tells me she wants earrings that have a diamond in them and they are a stud, then I can go out and at least I have an avenue of where to start. So this is a good thing, and it's good to have these descriptions, these job descriptions. You need to make sure that they have your FLSA status. So are they exempt, non-exempt? Are they full-time, part-time, or variable? That's important as it relates to the employer mandate, which I know a lot of you guys are dealing with right now, because that really helps in the initial process as far as when you start doing your calculations as they relate to the employer mandate. Skills and abilities, duties, competencies, physical attributes are important. You can't ask someone if they have a physical issue, but what you can do is you can give them a job description and say, can you meet these physical requirements? And that's really important, because what happens is later on, if they can't meet those requirements, then you have something to fall back on, especially if it gets into a Americans with Disabilities Act issue, because they're saying that they can meet those physical attributes. And then, as I said, the work environment. That's important, because if they're going to be outside in the heat all day or outside in the cold all day, they need to know that, and we need to make sure that they can do that. So after we have our job description, we want to develop our interview questions. And what I would suggest, again, is providing them a position summary or a job description that they can look at during the interview process. You want to make sure that you go through the specific qualifications for the position. So what's the relevant experience? What areas do they have to have knowledge in? Do they have to have a certification of some type? Those kind of things. You want to ask them about work history. You know, ask them about their last job. What did they like, not like? Why did they leave? Work habits. You want to talk to them about those things. So how do they handle interruptions? Are they good multitaskers? Any of those things that are kind of going to be particular to this job position, you want to make sure that you talk to them about that. You also want to make sure that you talk about required competencies. So how do you handle a mistake? And how carefully do you check your work? Things like that, so that you get an understanding, because if you're hiring an accounting clerk, that's important. How careful are you? How many times do you check your work before you move on? Those kind of things. So you really want to get, you know, a lot of times I remember back when I first started and I was hiring people, you know, I would basically have a conversation with them, and it wasn't always about the position. It was more trying to learn more about them. But really what you do want to do is you have to learn about them, but you also have to understand, are they going to meet the qualifications of the position? So that's very important. Some general questions that you can ask. You want to use open-ended questions because that gets them talking. You know, what kind of experience do you have? We require knowledge in this. So do you have experience in this area? Of all the work that you've done, what have you been the most successful? Give examples of your organizational skills. Again, in general, how many times do you proof and revise something before you're satisfied? So what we're trying to do, again, is use those open-ended questions, because if you can get them talking, they will tell you things that you may not otherwise have thought about to ask. Now, things that you can't ask are, you can't ask about, do they have children? You can't ask if they're pregnant. You can't ask if they're dating somebody. I know where I used to work, we had a supervisor who had a lot of turnover. Well, what he found out he was doing was he would bring a bunch of applicants in, interview them. If they weren't dating somebody, he would hire them, try to date them, and if they didn't date him, he would let them go, which obviously you can't do. But that's what he was doing. So you can't ask those questions. How old are you? You can't ask when they graduated high school. You can ask if they graduated high school, but not when. Have you filed workers' compensation claim? What are your political affiliations? You can't ask if he's a Republican or a Democrat. Those kind of things you really want to stay away from. And, there's ways to get that information. If you ask me, well, hey, tell me about yourself. I'm going to tell you I'm married, got 2 kids, I live in this area, and so forth. So you can get the information, but you can't ask it directly. Okay. Now, one of the big things is training. Anybody that's doing hiring, train them on how to do these interviews, because a lot of people, and we run into this all the time, a lot of these supervisors don't know any better, and they're holding these interviews and talking to these individuals as if they're sitting after work in a bar, and they're using the same kind of language and the same kind of speech, and you just can't do that, because your company is held liable for its management. So if you have management that's out doing these things, then your company is liable for that. So always train your supervisors. Some other things, and this is something that a lot of people are not aware of, is interview notes. You have to be careful with what you write. So you can't write down anything that's discriminatory. And I'll give you an example. We had a client, and they had a supervisor that was hiring. And that person, when they were hiring, what they would do is write the gender and the race on the applications. And that helped him understand or remember who that person was. We don't think he was doing it intentionally as far as to discriminate, but what he was doing was that was kept on the application, which was kept in the file, which if anything came up down the road and that information was written on that application, an attorney could tear that apart. So you don't write anything down that could be construed as discriminatory. Don't take notes from one applicant and not another. Just be consistent. What you don't want to do is somebody come in and say, hey, you took notes for all the white females, but none of the white males. You want to be consistent. And again, what's going to happen if there's a case where somebody sues you for not hiring them because they're saying it's discriminatory? A good attorney is going to walk in and say, I want all the applications and all the notes for everybody that you looked at during that hiring process. And so you want to make sure you're consistent. Also, when possible, quote these applicants word for word with quotes around their statement. That way it shows that it's not your conjecture, that you're actually writing what they said. Don't take notes on information that they volunteer that you couldn't otherwise ask. So don't write down Joe has 3 kids on the application. You can, as I said, they can volunteer that information, but you don't want to put that on the application or take a note. I'm sorry, you can't ask that during the interview. But what you don't want to do is if they volunteer that, you don't want to write that down, because later on they could come back and say, well, you asked the question. Also, the other thing to note is interview questions are just as much part of the hiring record as the application or the resume. So technically you're required to keep those on file for a year with the application. A couple of other things kind of outside of that I wanted to make sure I noted. When you are hiring, you want to make sure that you note that it is an at-will employment if you are in an at-will state. You want to make the job offer in writing. How much are they going to make? What are the benefits and those things? And also you want to make sure that you note that no contract is created. And that's important. Now that should be in your handbook, and hopefully the at-will and the no contract being created is in your handbook. But we do want to make sure that that's communicated to that applicant. So so the next step is we do the interviewing and we hire the individual. And so what should be in the hiring packet? And it's going to differ from company to company, but I did want to go ahead, and these are kind of some standard things that are typically in. From a tax perspective, you have your W-4, which is obviously the federal withholding. If you have state tax, you want to put your state withholding form. If you do work opportunity tax credits, which I know a lot of people in the grocery industry, that's a good industry for that. You want to make sure that you have whatever necessary forms that you need for that are in there. And then also, you're required by law now to include the Affordable Care Act notification of coverage options form. That's for every employer that falls under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that's pretty much everybody. Now, if you're not doing that, there's no penalty for not doing that. They say you have to, but I'm not going to fine you if you don't. So if you haven't been doing that, it may be a good idea to start putting that in there. Also, from a company perspective, application, if you're doing background checks, you want to make sure you put that authorization form, handbook acknowledgement form if you have a handbook. If you have other acknowledgement forms like cash handling policies, those kind of drug test policies, those kind of things, you want to have them sign those as well as I would have them sign the job description. So I would have that in that new hire packet as well. And then from an immigration perspective, you want to make sure you have your I-9 form. The I-9 form is the form that just states that that applicant is allowed to work within the United States. Failure to do that is a fine of up to $1,100 per form. So it's important that you do that. And then outside of the new hire packet, if your state is required to perform E-Verify, obviously you would need to do that as well. So from a high level, again, it's gonna differ a little bit from company to company, but from a high level, those are kind of the typical forms that we see within the hire packet. Now we talked about I-9s, and again, those are required, and not doing those are very there's a big fine for that. So you want to make sure you do it. So all employees that are hired after November 6, 1986 must have an I-9 on file. We do suggest that they're kept in a separate file. That way, if you're ever audited, you can hand them that file versus handing them the personnel file. If you hand them the personnel file, they have access to everything versus just the I-9. And then also, if you have individuals that are not citizens that are here temporarily on work visas and those things, you do want to make sure that you re-verify those documents when they expire. That's a current hot button, as you can imagine, with immigration and everything that's going on today. A good guide for I-9s is if you go to www.uscis.gov and just search for Form M-274. That's a really good guide on how to fill out the I-9. It also has examples of all the different forms that can be used from a verification perspective, and it has pictures. So that way, if you have somebody that is in on a visa or something like that, you can look at that document and it will have examples of what it should look like. Now, one thing I did want to do is we'll go through an I-9 real quickly as far as how to fill that out, because that's always a question. This is an I-9. This is Section 1. And, first you want to put the employee name. You want to put the home address. And in the home address, you cannot use a P.O. box. If they do not have a street address, they effectively will have to say, I live 3 blocks from the local Walmart or something. They will have to give some type of landmark answer for that, but they cannot use a P.O. box. The date of birth, the social security number, the email address. The date of birth is required. The social security number is optional. They don't have to put that on the form unless you're e-verifying. If you're e-verifying, they are required to do that. The email address and the phone number are optional, so they do not have to fill that in. They do have to attest to citizenship here in number 4, and then they would sign and date the form. And then if they had somebody that helped them prepare it, that person would sign their name here in the preparer or translator certification. Now, one thing that's important is these have to be filled out at the time of hire. Or no later than the time of hire. They can be filled out prior to the time that they start work, but after the acceptance. So you can't require them to fill these forms out before they accept the position. So that's important. If it's done after they're hired or after they start work, then there is a potential for a penalty. Now, so this is where the employee fills out. the employer fills out section 2, which is this section. So what you would do here in section 1 is put in the employee's last name from section 1, and then in section 2 you list all of the documents that they provide. Okay. Now, one thing that's important: section 2 must be filled out within 3 days of the date of hire. If it's after 3 days, then it's late and it's subject to a penalty. Also, one thing that's important is List B. If you're using List B and you are e-verifying, they have to provide a document that has a picture. Also, you have to put down the first day of wages, the first day of employment for wages in 3. In 4, that's where the employer attests to viewing the document. So that's where you're signing, saying, yes, I did view the documents, and you have to put the date you did that. And then you have to enter the business name and address. Okay, so that's an I-9 for a typical employee. Now, it's a little different because I know a lot of you hire individuals that are under 18. And so it's a little different for those individuals. So the differences are, number one, an individual under 18 cannot sign as the signature of the employee. What you do is in that section 1 block, you just put individual under age 18. Okay? And then what you do is have the parent or guardian sign in section 2 down here where it says signature of preparer or translator. Okay? So the employee does not sign this document. Their parent or guardian has to on their behalf. Now, the other thing is if they don't have a List B document, then what you would do is everything's the same, but under List B, you would just state individual under age 18, and then the employer would then again sign certifying that they've saw whatever documents that they could provide. Okay, so that's how you would do that for a minor. And again, I know a lot of you hire individuals under 18. So from an employee screening perspective, I'll go through real quickly. There's three main ones: background checks, drug testing, and behavior assessments. From background checks, one thing that's very important because you want to protect your business, employees, and clients, right? You want to make sure that whoever you have working there is not a threat to either another employee or a customer that walks in the door. Now, I know for us, as we do background checks for clients over the last 2 years, and this is in over a population of thousands of background checks, we see about a 15% criminal hit rate. So that's a relatively high rate. So we think it's important to do that for your security and safety as well as your customers. Also, one thing to note, not all background checks are created equal. Make sure you understand what you're ordering. A lot of background check companies put big fancy names on their background checks. In essence, what they're doing is going out and doing a real simple database search, which is an okay search, but it's not a great search. And so you want to make sure you understand what you're getting and that it equates to the position that you're hiring. You probably have a different background check search for your store manager and your cashiers. That may be different. And so make sure you really understand what you're getting there. Another thing I want to make sure is that you obtain written authorization from the employee before you do the background check. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires that you get a signed authorization from the employee to run background checks. In the Fair Credit Reporting Act, a lot of times people are confused. They think that's only for credit history. That is for any check into somebody's background. So you want to make sure that you really get that for all background checks. Also, there's some information that by law you have to provide that applicant when they sign that authorization form. So you want to make sure that you do that as well. Your background check company, if you have a good one, they should have all that information for you and can provide that to you. Drug testing. The big thing about drug testing is it's to reduce your liability. In a lot of states, you can deny automatically unemployment if they have a drug test that comes back positive. If they are, if it's suspicion, post-accident, whatever that, or random, whatever that may be. They can also, in some states, be denied workers' comp. So if they have an accident on your time and they're high, a lot of states you don't have to pay workers' comp on that. Also, if you meet the drug-free workplace standards, in a lot of states you can get workers' comp premium discounts. And typically those are 5%. So depending on your employee base, your workers' comp premiums, that may make sense, it may not. And then also doing that drug testing, obviously you're keeping out a sector of the population that may be more apt to steal or be a risk to your employees or your clients. So drug testing is really good to reduce that liability, and it also has some financial impacts for you as far as saving money on unemployment and workers' comp and premiums and those things. One thing you do want to do if you move to drug testing is you want to make sure you have a policy that states, you know, who you're going to test, when they're testing, how they're going to be tested, and the types of tests you're going to do, as well as you want to make sure that you get written authorization from those employees as well. Behavior testing, that's one thing that we do. I don't suggest that for every employee. I do suggest that for management employees. Basically what it does is it describes a person's behavior, and what you can do is then predict how they will act in the future. Okay, so depending on the job, they may or may not be a good fit, because if it's somebody that, and you're in a very high activity, it's a very high activity job, it has a lot of movement, those things, and you have somebody that comes back with a behavioral profile that says they really can't handle stress, it's probably not a good match. And so they're good for that. So they're good for ensuring a good match for job requirements. Also, what you'll find is if you have a bunch of type A's on the same team, they may not work well together. So it also will help you to build build teams that complement each other with strengths and weaknesses. And then it also provides supervisors with information on how they're perceived. So what happens is it will come back and it will tell that supervisor, if you run a good one, it will tell them how they perceive themselves, and with the same characteristics how other people typically view them. And so it helps them understand how to better relate to their employees as well as their peers. And so behavior testing is a good thing, again, for those management level employees. And so I think we are right on the button on time. So from an overview, that's from a very high level. What I think are some good areas to really focus on from the interviewing and the I-9s and the background checks and those things. And it's very important. Again, turnover costs a lot of money, and if we're not hiring the right people, it's just going to get worse from a financial perspective because of the cost that's related to it, and the culture aspect of it because you're having constant turmoil within your workforce.